Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found that stimulating and thought-provoking. We've heard from two slightly different perspectives. I'm going to ask now Tony Kern to join us back on the stage here, and I'll ask Sydney to take one of the pews. I've also fortunate enough to have Dr. Scott Shappell, who's Professor and Chair of the Department of Human Factors and Systems at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and I'm going to ask Scott, who is, again, a great supporter of the summit, and always one who is willing to put forward an opinion and a comment from his perspective. We're going to ask, if I can keep everybody in now, that we're going to ask a Q&A session. So I'm going to start off the Q&A session. We've got some red shirts here who'll come down to the front and grab the microphones. As I say, we've heard a couple of differing perspectives here, and we're going to open the floor to questions from those of you that are in the room. Okay, so as you formulate your questions, I'm going to start it off here. And I'm going to, we heard from Tony about how do we get the right people into safety quality. Don't tell somebody, I'm only going to put you in here for 18 months and then I'm going to let you go back to the job you really enjoy. We heard from Sydney about peer review group and get the people who actually do the work to think about how we can get that last bit of the curve down, right down to the bottom on the floor where we want it. So I'm going to open it up and ask the gents up here now, how do we get the right people into those jobs? How do we attract them and keep them and make the safety and quality side of things attractive and something that people want to go and contribute to, and that gives it credibility so that the others who we might go and assess and say, actually, that's not really the best way of doing it. It's not right and it's not wrong, but it's maybe not the best way of doing it. To make those people listen to their peers. So if I can throw that open. Tony, can I ask you to start off, please, and then I'll come around.
Sure. Well, I think the main thing, and as I look at different industries with regard to safety management, safety leadership, let's take, for example, pharmaceutical industry. There are some very tough standards. There are some very formal programs that those folks have to go through to become a true safety professional. It's a career field, right? And I don't think that's the case in aviation. I think in aviation, like I said, you might get hit in the forehead with a Nerf missile when you walk past the boss's office, come to a couple of conferences, maybe read a book or two, and you're good to go. And so I think probably the short answer for attracting people is, hey, let's formalize this educational and practical experience a little bit better so that people don't feel a little bit adrift when they come in. At least that would be my opening step.
Tony? Just causing chaos by wandering around. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, in fact, I'm going to stand over here, Sydney, because this is where my spot was for the holes in the cheese.
But that's in 1980, man. That's,
okay, I'm going to come over here then a little bit to the left. No, but I do think that one of the things I was going to suggest is that one of the things we did in the military and the Navy is it was always, and Tony, I'm sure this was the same way in the Air Force, being the safety officer was not something you aspired to. You wanted to either be the ops guy or the maintenance guy. And that's just the only way you were going to get promoted. But what we did in the Navy, shortly about right here, what we did is basically said, you know what, if you want to be a commanding officer and you want to be an admiral someday, you're going to have to serve as a safety department head. Whether it's a year or more, that is now a billet that everybody wants. If nothing more than just a ticket punch, unfortunately. But it was a means to do that. And I do think that we're seeing now more and more that safety is becoming at least in vogue, and it's something that people can have a career path in some industries. I agree. One of the things, and I was going to ask you guys, if you really think, one of the things I've noticed is the lifespan of no offense, Duncan, but the lifespan of a VP for safety is about 2 to 3 years, and then they move on. And you're at what, year 2?
Yeah.
Okay.
To the last summit.
Yeah, I'm over here now. So I just wonder I don't mean to change the topic, but I wonder what your thoughts are. I just did, yeah. So, so I don't know what you all are thinking there, because that's something that's very disturbing. You don't necessarily see that for a VP for operations or something. They may be there forever. Or at least move up to president and stuff like that.
Well, okay, so you busted. Don't change the topic. Let me first try to answer Duncan's question genuinely, which is, it's interesting, the question is asked from within the current paradigm, right, which is who needs to be a quality assurance person. who needs one in the first place? Why don't we even start with that question? What role are you fulfilling? Now, many organizations that I've seen that have grown through this slightly longer than some organizations in this community may have become quite disenchanted, and they see the regulatory compliance and quality assurance role as increasingly different from the role to assure resilience, not necessarily safety, but resilience. And so some organizations that I've spoken with have even created what they call a numbers parking lot. So a parking lot sort of in their computer system where all the numbers go in order to keep the regulators happy. But it has nothing to do with creating resilience operationally, right? And so perhaps what we're moving toward is, yes, we have regulators to keep happy and we need to show all these things, but ultimately this is about, if we want to make that last, this thin edge of the wedge go away, we may not need a quality assurance officer to do that. We may need a resilience or an operational resilience officer or something like that.
But aren't you just changing the name of the person? I mean, all you've really done is a name change, but you haven't necessarily changed. Well,
we haven't written the job description yet, so
okay,
we could do that. But what's in that job description would be, I think, first of all, a great flexibility with respect to existing rules and procedures, right? Deference to, yes, I agree with Tony, and back in 1911, absolutely, right, in certain cases, but an open-mindedness to how to solve difficult operational problems under the pressure of resource constraints and multiple goal conflicts, right? That would go into that description. Looking for places where I should stop because we haven't even gotten to your next question. No, I don't want to. I've spoken long enough.
Okay, I wanted to open up. I said I'd open up to the floor. So if you can put your hand up if you do want to ask a question, we'll get a microphone to you straight away. I'm just pleased. I'm slightly depressed now because I haven't asked the question about how do we encourage the right people to go and get them into safety quality. Nobody mentioned doubling the salary. Thanks. And having invited Scott up at the last minute to join the conversation, he's told me I've got approximately 18 months to go. So thanks. But the saving grace is that Sydney says if I change my title, I can reinvent myself. So there is some light at the end of the tunnel.
And double your salary.
And double my salary, yeah. Okay, so we'll make it. Fernando.
A question for Professor Dekker. I'm Fernando. I work for Petrobras in Brazil, aviation advisor. And I wonder if you might endorse the reasoning that most HFDM programs or FDM programs, as they're designed today, they're actually wasting their bigger potential because they're fundamentally designed to have less of what we don't want. We don't want exceedances, we have gatekeepers, this and that. And why couldn't we shift the mindset of these programs to have more of what we want by recognizing and rewarding the outstanding piloting skills that are desired? Why don't we have a Red Bull Air race of stabilized approach for offshore pilots, where HFDM would be the judge? And so I wonder your thoughts about it.
Bom dia, Fernando. Muy obrigado. So the response, I think, it can be short and sweet, and that is that I am very happy that people like you and the manufacturers of these pieces of kit, right? I spoke to Casey this morning, for example, briefly, are in the same room. I think ultimately what you want to assure is that these things are not technology driven, right? Not driven by the sheer capability. Oh, look at all the cool stuff we can do for you, right? And then you end up with 150,000 data traces every half second, right? And you go, who cares, right? Particularly Bill goes, that's too much, right? I can't, that's not intelligence, that's data overload. There is no easy or silver bullet to that other than a hard conversation on what it is that you guys will want and where you see your major problems that you want to keep tabs of. Now, and the final remark is, even though you, Fernando, believe that that's where your risk is created, don't be too sure, right? Just a very brief example, which is this, and it really perturbs me, right? I have a student who works in the regional airline business who, in the mid-2000s, were occupied with the idea of high-altitude upsets because of a couple of incidents that they had, and one fatal with a ferry flight with 2 pilots. And so, and Tony knows about this. Now, the whole industry organizes its intelligence gathering around that because that's where the holes showed up. Oh my God, we need to do something about that. And one morning, my student gets a call. And it's just, we've lost one. We've lost one. And he says, where? Was it a high altitude? No, it wasn't a high altitude. Went off the end of the wrong runway. right? Barry Turner, 1978, that's just 10 years before where Scott is standing, right? I love you. Barry Turner called that a decoy phenomenon, right? That you throw all your organization's intelligence gathering and analytic resources onto that decoy because that's what you believe is necessary. And then the crocodile shows up, right? I mean, great example. What a beautiful example Tony showed us, right? I think the question you need to consider in that conversation is not just how do we deal with the lions, right? No. It's how do we see the crocodile below the surface, right? And so that one Tony can answer.
You're asking the right question, and there's some other people thinking about it. I'm going to share this with you. We're working right now with a company who's looking at merit-based pay based on flight data monitoring data. When you get, and this is all about getting the cream of the crop out of the next generation. So when you come to work with their company, you can choose seniority-based or merit-based. If you choose merit-based, you can get to the top of their pay scale in 3.5 years. Okay? Now, you can also go down. But assignments, pay, everything is going to be based around, I think they're calling it 100 points of light right now. They're identifying those specific data traces that they want to measure. So, yeah, some people are thinking about using it in positive ways. You want to talk about upsetting the industry labor market if that were ever to take place, but they're definitely looking at it as an economic solution that will tie into safety, quality, and all those other things, and HR. So that cross-pollination of getting everybody thinking about how these things might leverage is definitely taking place, and the industry is going to have to do that because of the major changes that we're about to see.
Okay, so as we pass the microphones, anybody else wants to ask a question from the floor, put your hand up, please. But I might come back to Scott now, just on that point from Fernando.
I would go ahead. Go ahead, and we'll take the next question.
Okay, let's go for the next question. We'll give the gent standing up. Thank you very much.
I got a question for Tony. I really appreciate your emphasis on importance of compliance with SOPs and creating a culture where that becomes normative. One of the challenges that I've observed is that we have an over-specification in a lot of operations, so that actually getting the job done operationally becomes almost impossible while we try to follow all the rules. And so non-compliance becomes then normative. And I just wondered how you see us addressing that, because I think that's one of the real challenges. As has already been identified, as we focus on filling all these holes, we've created this massive amount of procedures and memos, and it becomes very difficult operationally to follow all the procedures. So how do we work backwards from that, then create a culture of compliance, but work our way out of that backlog?
Yeah, and I appreciate the question because it also lets me address something that Sydney said earlier. It's all about decision space. Whose decision is it, right? And so there are certain things that must be in policy and procedure, and those need to be mandatory and equally enforced for everybody. But there's a lot of stuff on the other side that's technique and cultural norms that we need to keep discretionary. So the question is, your question is, what if we've already gotten so far into that discretionary area? How do we deconfigure that? And Sydney said, well, nobody ever wants to get rid of a safety rule. True, but you can do it. And there's 2 or 3 basic steps, and I'll be very brief with this. The first is you put every rule that you have on the table. This typically takes about a week. Then you ask which one of these are A, being violated most and are operationally impairing us from getting the job done. You'll have no problem getting that feedback if you ask your people. Now, once you have that, you begin to deconfigure by saying, do we know why this rule was written, by whom and when? And have circumstances changed so that we no longer need this archaic rule? If the answer is yes, you put it in the maybe we erase it. Second, if the answer is we don't know why or we don't know when, that goes in a special pile, but I would very much caution not to erase that one until you find out why and when those rules were written. But you can probably look at your operating procedures. We've done this with firefighting and law enforcement, and get rid of about 20 to 25% of them just with that exercise. What's being violated, what's impairing mission readiness, and then you sit down and have that discussion about, is it still valid in today's environment with today's training, with today's technology? So very good question, and you're right, you get too many rules, you're guaranteeing non-compliance.
Can I add a subtlety to that? Because I fully subscribe to what Tony has suggested as a recommendation. In fact, and I recommend this for all of you. A couple of things. One is, don't get this done by McKinsey people, all right? Do this yourself. Make this done by people who do the work, right? It's critical to get operational expertise in there. And the second thing that I've seen in experiences like this with oil and gas and other sectors is, and this is interesting, Tony, it's not just getting rid of a particular quantity of procedures, but it is actually flushing redundant stuff out of current procedures. When you look in detail at your procedures, what you'll see is it's a lot of insurance management, liability management, training, all of that gets thrown into these procedures, and you can clean them off of that and just say, these are the 5 steps or the 2 things you need to do before you take off, right? Shrink it down to the absolute bare necessity.
You know, I want to just add something to that, because I do think, I want to make sure that I understand what I'm hearing, because I don't think either of you, well, certainly you're not, Tony, but you're not advocating that you would do away with all policies, rules, regulations, procedures.
No, and I've made that very clear.
I want to make that very clear, because sometimes it comes across that way, because I don't think that's true, because if you just think about driving, there are a lot of rules out there that prevent us from having major accidents and pileups. It's really the annoyances or the redundancy, as you pointed out. And I think that's the challenge. So, and even when we start talking about accountability, you're not suggesting that we don't hold people accountable when they break certain rules. No. I think that we all understand that there are times, your own children, when you have to exercise some accountability. And there are rules in your own house, some of which your kids don't understand why they have to adhere to that. Why can't I have the candy before bed? Well, because we don't want you to have a tummy ache and be up and rolling around all night or spooling off the ceiling. So sometimes we don't understand why those rules and regulations or procedures are in place. And it's not really meant necessarily for you to understand that right now. But they're there because there's a reason for it. I want to believe there's a reason for it. Maybe I'm Pollyanna here.
Yeah, a little bit, but that has a purpose, I understand. I think what Tony has been identifying, Scott, is that we have a challenge facing us with a horde of Gen Yers coming in, right? Okay. And I think an industry that faces that sort of influx from below has today a really interesting challenge, and Tony has already alluded to this. These are not necessarily kids who take authority in the same way that you or I would have when we grew up, right? And certainly not you. But what does Gen Y do? They don't listen to authority necessarily for knowing what to do. They listen to the crowd, right? Answers to problems are crowdsourced. This is how they gather there. I mean, you showed the picture and answers are in the cloud. So you look it up. You don't know the answer, boom, you look it up. It's always there at your fingertips, right? And so they have a completely different way of relating to these sorts of things. Now, that takes nothing away, I think, of the basic tenets of accountability and questions related to that. I think, however, that we have to be sensitive to the fact that if you get that generation in, holding people accountable, holding them accountable, merely by pulling the authority or hierarchy card, guess who's going to look like the fool, right? The old guy, not the young Gen Yer, right? And so accountability needs to be exacted by people who are legitimate in the eyes who are being held accountable. Does that make sense, right? They need to have some legitimacy, not just the power to hold them accountable, but legitimate, all right? And I think ultimately that the relationship that you paint up, right? There are certain rules that I have with my kids, sure, but even there, I would explain why as you just did as well. And I don't think that is necessarily a model for this industry. I mean, they don't employ their children. They employ colleagues. These are colleagues who are operational, right? And so, yeah, it may not be as experienced as they, but to treat them like children, if you do that, they'll behave like children.
No, I wasn't suggesting that you would treat them like children. I think what I'm saying is that sometimes there are rules and regulations in place that we don't always understand why they're there, or policies or procedures in place. Do you really know why all the procedures in your startup procedure were there? Right. Probably not.
No, fair.
I mean, I certainly don't.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of, and so this, And I don't think that's the avenue from which you come. I've known both of you for 20 years.
Yep.
And so I know that they're very divergent. I'm trying to get a sense of where those opinions are so we can move towards the middle. But
okay, I want to get at least one more question. And so, Tom, I think you were on your feet.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. It would be interesting to explore a little more, and Dr. Dekker, you referenced this a little bit, this whole concept of duty conflict. And I just think, having seen Scott and Tony's things before, this is really where, so I'm sort of air medical in a pretty hostile, operating environment. And we find, we've developed finally a policy for non-prescribed interventions because we just end up with this constant mash in these complex things of duty conflict. And I would love to, because I think that I'm not hearing quite agreement around all of those things when it comes to compliance, and would love to hear that explored a little more.
Well, I'll take the first shot at it. I think routine noncompliance is a festering disease of sloppiness that's invaded our industry. And I think that yet you can be overregulated, and there are certain risk thresholds that probably will encourage people to push those borders, especially in high-risk things like air medical. But that's not where most, I think, of it occurs. I think most of it occurs because of apathy, boredom, and cultural norms. So I believe you need to have the discussion right up front, especially with new hires who may not look to authority, and say, here at Tony Kern Airlines, there are certain fundamental rules that you will not cross, and if you do, it's a condition for unemployment. And you make that clear to the beginning. But if you make that clear and then they go out there and they see it being practiced by people in your organization, you've done yourself double damage. You've created the aura of authority that doesn't actually exist, or QA that doesn't actually exist. So I believe we need to simplify it. We need to keep the rules and maybe even a doctrinal approach which really simplifies it. Hey, we want you to do your best in full compliance each and every time, and we want you to help everybody do that to build these habit patterns of excellence. But I think you also have to train and enforce those foundational aspects of compliance and make that a core value in your organization, or you're begging for trouble.
I think this is clearly where in fact, even Scott, where HVACs would say, go deeper, right? If you want to call it routine noncompliance, that already, to me, is a very judgmental term. That's not a cause of trouble. It's a symptom of deeper trouble, right? I think to Scott and me, but if I'm speaking too much for you, show me. That would be evidence of organizational goal conflicts that are not reconciled and that are being pushed down into operational units for people to sort out on the line, all right? And they're not given enough guidance, not given enough, perhaps this is where Tony comes in, not enough indoctrination about what really matters in order to reconcile that well. But then when you have an organization that fires a pilot for saying, no, I don't want to fly because we have safety as a highest priority, I don't want to get shot out of the sky with my clients, I think that sends the sorts of signals of an organization that routine noncompliance is demanded if you want to keep your job. I have yet to find the first organization, including the U.S. Air Force, that is capable of saying, we want full compliance and we also want you to keep your job. It's impossible. It's impossible. The reality of our reality, to speak with Bill, is too complex, all right? So back to the gentleman at the back who were speaking just before you, already showed that full compliance leads to the job grinding to a halt. We call this a work-to-rules strike, right? And in some countries, air traffic controllers are really well practiced at it, right? And so I think it is really short-sighted to stop and say this is a motivational, attitudinal problem that we can make go away by beating the human harder and threatening them with dismissal. I think that leads to cultures of risk secrecy, of silence, of bullying, of fear, and of not learning much of value at all. So my recommendation is, if you see this, and your intervention may have helped, but try to make the goal conflict visible. Because if it's not visible, you can't talk about it, all right? And if things are not visible, they are left to fester, all right? And bad ideas, like we can beat noncompliance out of people, are really left to fester when not discussed in the open. So I'm glad we are.
So just one point. So when you're talking work to rule strikes, and I realize there's a lot of silly rules out there, but let's just take a very specific example of sterile cockpit. Probably the most violated critical safety rule in existence. And
so how do you know it's that critical if it's violated the whole time? Apparently we don't have the data to say that it is.
Well,
that's faith-based, Tony. That's just faith. I mean,
okay,
you're moralizing. Where's the data?
I'm gonna give you a couple of examples.
Negative examples. But
let's look at the Louisville, or it wasn't Louisville, it was Lexington accident. We all know, especially.
How long do you have?
Especially if we're talking. I'll use anecdotal data from my own career. The 4 or 5 times I've gotten in trouble close to the ground, it's always been because there was something else going on in the cockpit that took away from the sterile cockpit piece. I think that is a red letter rule that could be, should be, must be enforced. I've seen some organizations take it so far as creating an additional procedure just to brief it at engine start. Hey, sterile cockpit to 10,000 feet, made it a highlight. It did come from the analysis they did by talking to their people saying, yeah, we think this is a problem here. And at 10,000 feet, they say sterile cockpit off. So yeah, I believe there are some hard and fast rules that we must enforce.
But the data is probably useless, Tony, because every time you didn't get in trouble, you probably also didn't have a sterile cockpit. So it doesn't mean anything.
So if it's 88% effective to have sterile cockpit not in place, so you can survive 99% of the time. Let's not use it. I mean, so they're getting away. All right. So anyway, you see where I'm going with this.
I'm going to raise my flag as the facilitator and adjudicator. What we set out to do when we set up this morning's keynote address was to bring different ideas, different perspectives, different viewpoints, and different ways of attacking the same root problem. I think we've got it. So. Whilst everybody's still on talking terms, I am going to draw a
sterile stage.
I'm going to give my thanks on behalf of everyone here to Tony Kern, first of all, for his keynote address. To Dr. Sidney Dekker for joining us and giving a cracking keynote. And to Dr. Scott Shappell for coming in and mixing the pot a little bit.
Just sliding away.
I've got some gifts that I'm going to present to the presenters, but I'll do that after we've got everybody moving in the right direction, just for ease of time. But I'll ask you to make reference to your participant pack. Okay, so reach for this, reach for the timetable. It's replicated up on the screens, as I said before. We're on break now until 13:30. Then it's personal program time, okay? I'd ask you to take all of your belongings from here because we're going to miraculously change this very large auditorium into 6 or 9 presentation rooms. Thank you for your involvement this morning. Thanks for your attention. Have a great summit, and we'll speak to you later.
Good job.
Okay.